안녕하세요. 한국합창지휘자협회 이사장 김옥숙입니다. 저희 협회는 합창지휘 전임 교수님들과 전문 합창단 상임지휘자들이 참여하는 국내 가장 권위 있는 합창 전문 단체로서 고모님들과 상임 이사님들을 포함하여 총 65명의 이사님들과 간사 1명이 있고 총 200여 명의 정회원들로 구성되어 있습니다. 저희 협회에서는 주요 사업으로 매년 다음과 같은 두 가지 사업을 하고 있습니다. 첫째는 매년 가을에 열리는 대한민국 합창대제전입니다. 예술의 전당이나 롯데 콘서트홀에서 전국 전문 합창단들이 모여서 2, 3일 동안 연주회를 갖습니다. 둘째는 매년 봄과 가을에 개최하는 합창지휘 세미나입니다. 올 가을 세미나는 코로나19로 인해 처음으로 비대면 영상으로 진행하게 되었습니다. 이번 세미나의 강사는 미국 일리노이대학의 합창지휘 교수이신 앤드류 도널드 메길 교수입니다. 메길 교수님은 해외에서 강의와 연주로 널리 알려져 있고 특히 르네상스 등 고음악 분야의 전문가로 정평이 있는 분입니다. 오늘 세미나 주제는 르네상스 합창 연주를 위한 실질적 방법으로 르네상스 합창 음악에 관한 전반적인 이해와 연주 방식에 대해 매우 유익한 강의가 될 것입니다. 본 강의는 현재 금요일 6시에 시작하여 다음 주 화요일 17시까지 12일간 게시할 것입니다. 유튜브에 KCDA 한국합창지휘자협회를 치고 들어오시면 되니까요. 주변에 지휘자님들이나 합창에 관심이 있는 모든 분들에게 알려주시면 감사하겠습니다. 이제 메길 교수님의 영상 강의를 시작하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Hello, I'm Andrew Megill. I'm the Director of Choral Activities at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm also the Chorus Master for the Montreal Symphony and the Director of Choirs for the Carmel Bach Festival in Carmel, California. It's an honor and a privilege and a great joy to be able to speak with you from the United States, to all of my colleagues in the choral world in Korea that I have known and respected several of the Korean choral conductors that have come to the United States and have learned from them about the thriving and beautiful choral culture that is part of Korean musical culture. And so it's really exciting to get to be part of it, even if this year, because of COVID, it has to happen long distance. When I spoke with our hosts about what would be helpful, they suggested that perhaps one of the things I could talk about was music of the 15th and 16th centuries, music of the Renaissance, which is such a beautiful core piece of repertory, but in the United States, at least, is woefully underperformed. And so this lecture will be about Renaissance choral music. We are so lucky as choral musicians to have such a long history, full of extraordinary and beautiful pieces to explore. One of the largest corners of the repertoire is music of the Renaissance. Throughout the rest of music history, choral music can be a bit relegated to the sidelines. For instance, the 19th century is really dominated by symphonies, concertos, string quartets, and opera. But the 15th and 16th centuries, the Venn diagram of music and choral music are almost completely overlapping. Almost every composed piece from this period was intended first and foremost for vocal performance. It might be surprising, given this enormous body of beautiful choral pieces, that 16th century music isn't performed more regularly or frequently. Perhaps some of the reasons for its general neglect are the fact that conductors are often a bit intimidated by performing Renaissance music and have allowed it to become the exclusive purview of specialist ensembles, such as the Tallis Scholars or the Huelgas Ensemble. As lucky as we are to have such refined choirs performing and recording this music, it is far too beautiful and rich a corpus of music to leave only to the specialists. I hope today to be able to offer some practical suggestions to make the study and performance of this music more approachable. You and your choirs will gain so much by singing it. For me, the most expressive and beautiful feature of Renaissance music is the way the individual lines unfold, the way melodic tension and release ebb and flow. Music from later periods is often governed by the harmony, but the polyphony of the Renaissance is more often purely linear, creating a web of independently undulating voices equal in interest and importance. And there is nothing quite as beautiful as that web of voices. This aspect of Renaissance music is due at least in part to the overwhelming presence of chant in the lives of 15th and 16th century musicians. Although they wrote primarily in polyphony, and the music that is most famous from the period is polyphonic, the music that these composer-performers sang every day of their lives, day in and day out, was almost exclusively monophonic, and their entire musical worldview grew out of that experience of living and breathing plain chant. Here's a bit of lovely chant to listen to. What makes this chant so transcendently beautiful? To me, it's the way the line ebbs and flows. It's never static, always moving towards or away from a goal in a way that feels organic and inevitable, but at the same time is completely unpredictable. This is mostly due to the fact that it is ametrical music. That is, the pulse is grouped irregularly in alternating and unpredictable groups of twos and threes. Most music from the Baroque onwards is built on the principle of meter, where the pulse is regularly grouped into patterns of stress and unstress, and therefore we have 4/4 or 3/4. And this is one of the major reasons that Renaissance polyphony is so gratifying to sing or to listen to, but also one of the major difficulties for 21st century performers who are steeped in long traditions of repetitive meter. So the first major question for this lecture that I'd like to pose is, how can we recognize the shapes of Renaissance polyphony, and how can we encourage our singers to execute them with the expressive independence that brings this music fully to life? Our goal is to approach this music in the same way Renaissance musicians would have, finding the flow of non-metric linear motion which was born out of chant, and freeing ourselves from the anachronism of bar-line accents. It might help to consider how Renaissance notation differs from modern notation. There are two particularly significant ways in which this notation is different. First, music in the 15th and 16th centuries was sung from individual part books rather than from score. That means that, like modern orchestral players, singers saw only their own lines. For instance, the soprano sang from a part which had only the soprano pitches, rather than the full score modern choral singers are used to using today, where you can see what everyone is singing. The second particularly significant way in which Renaissance notation differs from modern notation is that these parts did not use bar lines. Now we'll take a look at an example of a part book from the Renaissance. This is a print of the tenor part of the Agnus Dei from the Bird Mass for 4 voices. You'll find the link to this in the list of links that was provided with this lecture. Here are some practical tips on how to help you and your singers create the shapes that bring this music to full flower. First, a group of my graduate students here at the University of Illinois will sing Palestrina's motet Sicut Cervus, observing the bar lines as if it were a 19th century piece. The easiest way to add shape to a Renaissance motet is to exaggerate the word stresses. There are some limits to this approach, which we'll allude to a little bit later, but a good first step would be to let the stress-unstress patterns of the text inform the music. That is, to lean into the accented syllables and to lean away from the unaccented syllables. The same group of graduate students will now sing the same passage from Palestrina's Sicut Cervus, emphasizing more the stresses of the words to create more elegant and musical shapes. Notice right off the bat that in modern notation, the tenor has a downbeat on the second unstressed syllable of sicut, and another downbeat on the final syllable of desiderat. And notice how much more gracious the line is when the first and third notes are accentuated, and the final syllables of sicut, the kut, and desiderat, the rat, are unstressed. Although word stress is a good first step, sometimes it is not enough. Some languages don't really have stressed and unstressed syllables, French, for example. And even Latin settings from this period are so heavily influenced by the vernacular languages of their performers that sometimes Latin settings can't be sung musically with what we think of as correct scansions from modern Italian Latin. This is especially true the earlier you go in the Renaissance, or in composers whose first language was French. Finding expressive shapes in the music of Josquin, for instance, is often problematic if you rely only on word stress. When word stress isn't enough, the signposts we can use for identifying stress notes are two. First, long notes, and second, high notes. We can see an example of this if we look again at Palestrina's Sicut Cervus, this time in the soprano part in measures 8 through 13. On the long melisma on the word aquarum, we would do well to think of the following notes as having more stress than those surrounding them. The D in measure 9, which is both longer and higher than the surrounding pitches. The B that ties across bar line 10. Remember that in the original notation without bar lines, this would have looked exactly the same as the B 2 notes later. Both could be transcribed as half notes. The D on the downbeat of bar 11, and the B that is across the bar line of measure 12. Paige Graham, a wonderful soprano from here at the University of Illinois, will now sing to us this passage, beginning at the pickup to measure 7, first as a singer with little or no experience with Renaissance music, and then performed with all her considerable experience and understanding of 16th century music. Listen for the differences in shapes that come primarily from the word stresses. Another problem with using only word stress is that the placement of specific syllables under specific notes, what we call text underlay, was largely considered the job of the singer, not the composer in the Renaissance. So the composer might not clearly indicate which syllables actually fall on which notes. This can be confusing, but it can also mean that we have considerable leeway as performers to change the text underlay. Note, for example, you might choose to move the syllable qua in the passage Paige just sang to one note later, so the change in syllable coincides with the long, high-stressed note. The control of textual underlay shifts from performer to composer or publisher as music starts to appear in print. The music publishing industry gets its start in around 1500, so early in the period one has much more latitude in making choices about textual underlay. I do it all the time in composers like Dufay, Akagam, and Josquin, but not so much in late Renaissance composers like Palestrina or Bird. You might have noticed that once you've identified these stressed notes, that groupings of notes between the stresses emerge, groupings of either 2 beats or 3 beats, or multiples of these. 4 beats could be thought of as 2 plus 2, for example. I find it very helpful to mark these in my own score, and sometimes I even ask the singers to mark them. I use a triangle over notes to mark a group of 3, and an L to mark a group of 2. Another really helpful way to explore the music of the Renaissance is to write out your own version of Renaissance part books, although using modern notation. So you write out the notes, leaving out all the bar lines and taking out any ties and replacing them with the larger note values that are equivalent to that. Here's an example from a score of Secucherus on CPDL. You'll find it again in the list of links that's been provided for you. And here's the soprano part again, with markings I use to differentiate groups of 2s and 3s. If you haven't done a lot of Renaissance music, I don't think there's a more useful exercise to go through as a conductor than to write out the music in part book style, without the bar lines, and then to think through all the natural groupings of 2s and 3s. Remember that although we're looking for stressed notes, no two stresses in music are exactly alike. The most beautiful performances not only recognize which are the strong notes, but which of a pair of strongs might be the strongest. You'll see some of these ideas from the use of double dashes in the marked soprano part that we just talked about. Here's another example of how rebarring Renaissance music can bring it to life. William Byrd's Ave Verum Corpus is unusual in having so much homophony, but the fact that all voices are singing the same text at the same time also makes clear how much damage can be done to performance by reading the bar lines too strongly, bar lines which were, of course, not there in the original notation. Note, for example, measures 8 through 9, where the word vere should be heard as a group of 3, or measure 16 and after, cuius is a group of 3, as is latus. The alto, tenor, and bass on perforatum is a group of 3, followed by a group of 2, while the soprano on perforatum does the reverse, perfo as a group of 2 and ra as a group of 3. Soon after, the words unda fluxit depict the flow of water and blood, which the text talks about, by writing them as groups of 3 which flow down in the soprano and in answering voices. We'll next hear the students from the University of Illinois sing the passage Vere Passum, first without much awareness of the word stresses or the actual Renaissance shapes, following the bar lines, and then more fluently. The use of homophony at the beginning of the motet also makes the breaking off into more independent part writing even more emotionally poignant at the climax of the motet, O Dulcis and Miserere. And by now, you're probably thirsty to hear some actual music and a little tired of hearing me talk. I'm a little tired of hearing me speak. I would much rather hear the voice of William Byrd. So we'll hear a complete performance of Byrd's Ave Verum by the graduate students at the University of Illinois. What a beautiful piece. A second area of performance practice that I thought might warrant discussion is musica ficta. The relationship between composer and performer was somewhat different in the 15th and 16th centuries than it is today. We tend to work under the assumption that our job is to execute the wishes of the composer as closely as we can. But in the Renaissance, the two roles of performer and composer overlapped much more than today. We've already mentioned that text underlay was within the purview of the singers often, and not the composer. Even the choice of pitches, to a certain extent, and under certain situations, was the job of the singer, rather than the person who wrote the piece. Musica ficta is a term that refers to what we as modern performers might think of as chromatic alterations of pitches, which the singers were expected to make when they sang Renaissance polyphony. If you've performed much Renaissance music and worked from excellent editions, you've probably seen sharps or flats above the staff, above certain notes. These are the editor's suggestions for when and how to apply the rules of musica ficta. My main advice is not to be scared by this. If you haven't done much Renaissance music, just find an edition by a reputable scholar or one that's published by a company that specializes in 16th century music, and they'll tell you their thoughts about ficta, and trust them. If you'd like to explore this a little more deeply and become a little more independent from what other editors might think, we'll talk through now some of the guidelines for musica ficta. For musical examples, we'll use the first movement of a gorgeous mass by Josquin des Près, the Kyrie from the Missa de Beata Vergine, which can be found at one of the links provided for you. This particular link will take you to the Josquin Research Project, which is a fascinating set of scores housed at Stanford University. The Josquin Project has scores available for everything Josquin composed, and a lot of other music by other composers from the same period. And it offers you the choice of scores with or without editorial ficta. So it's a great place to start studying ficta, and you can see what smart and experienced editors suggest, but you can also look at the scores without their suggestions and see if you would come to the same conclusions. One of the most important points I'd make about musica ficta is that it is a requirement. It is not historically defensible to just ignore ficta. Musica ficta is mentioned in so many documents of the Renaissance that there's just no doubt that it was an everyday part of performing music in the 15th and 16th centuries. We're often taught a bit as 21st century musicians to just slavishly reproduce every note exactly as it appears on a score. But to do exactly that without making the decisions that musica ficta should force upon us actually does a great disservice to Renaissance music. And so don't try that. Make sure you're trying to apply ficta as we think it probably should be. Here are some of the ways musica ficta can and should be applied. Number one, a singer would apply ficta to avoid tritones or other awkward intervals in a melodic line. So if an alto in a particular line had the written pitches in their score F, G, A, B natural, and they came in relatively short time span, the distance between F and B natural, that tritone, would be heard as awkward, and the singer would have naturally just made the B a B flat with no fuss and no discussion, and it would have just been helped that way. And the composer would have had no objections. It's what they would have expected to happen, actually. Another second reason to avoid to use ficta is to avoid tritones vertically. The first example was avoiding tritones in a single linear line. This is avoiding tritones between two voices singing at the same time. It might be easier to understand this if we take a look at an example from the Kyrie Mass, from the Kyrie that we mentioned just before, the link to the Josquin Mass. If you look at the Christe in measure 27 and 30, you'll see that there are written E naturals in the bass, but you'll also see that in the second half of each bar, the tenor very strongly sings a B flat, meaning that there will be a tritone sounding between the E natural of the bass and the B flat of the tenor. Every editor I know and I think that the basses would have applied ficta and sung the E's as E flats. A third, and maybe the most important use of musica ficta for us to think about as modern performers is the way that ficta is used to clarify cadences. Although we have to be careful to understand that cadences in the Renaissance doesn't mean exactly the same thing as a cadence does to us today. Modern musicians tend to think of a cadence as a chord progression from, say, a dominant chord to a tonic chord. However, in the Renaissance, composers and performers thought of cadences as being linear progressions, not chords, but individual lines. This comes again from chant, where there are cadences in chant, but they're not defined harmonically. They're defined by the melodic line either descending by step or ascending by step to tonic. In Renaissance polyphony, this is confirmed by a second voice that duets with the primary voice that resolves to either an octave or a unison to create a cadence. If they resolve to an octave, they approach it by contrary motion, expanding outward from a sixth. So, for instance, to land on the unison, on the octave C, the previous pitches would be D and B, and those would expand outwards to C and C. If they resolve to a unison, they still approach by contrary motion, but this time instead of expanding outwards, they collapse inward. So to approach a unison, the two voices approach it by third. So for instance, again, if we wanted to find a cadence on the pitch C between two voices collapsing inward, one would approach it from the pitch B, one would approach it from the pitch D, resolving to the unison C. The rule for ficta is that the interval which precedes the cadence should be widened if it's a sixth, and narrowed if it's a third. This could be a little confusing, so let's look at an example. If we look at measure 11 of the Josquin Kyrie, we'll see that the sopranos and altos make a cadence on C on the third beat. And you can also see that the approach is by expansion. They move in contrary motion, and the pitches which precede this octave C are a sixth, a B flat in the soprano and a D in the alto. However, the ficta rule says the cadence the chord which precedes the cadence should be widened. Therefore, the B flat becomes a B natural. And if you look in the version of the Mass with Musica Ficta by the Josquin Project website, you'll see that the editors there agree. So I must be right. Another good example might be in measure 18, where we have two cadences. The alto and bass resolve to D on the third beat, while the soprano and tenor resolve to their octave on the following downbeat, on G. So applying the ficta rule, we'd widen the sixth that precedes the octave in the alto bass, sharpening the alto C to C sharp, for instance, and then doing the same for the soprano-tenor duet, sharpening the soprano F to F sharp. You might notice that the cadence here is a little bit ornamented, but it doesn't change the basic function of the sixth expanding to an octave, and therefore the need for ficta. If you were particularly bright or experienced, you may have noticed that there would be another way to widen the pre-cadential sixth. Rather than sharpening the top note, which is what we've done so far, you could also flatten the bottom note. So for instance, in the same alto bass passage, measure 11 of the Kyrie, you have a choice. You could have the bass sing E flat, rather than having the alto sing C sharp. There's no hard and fast rule about which way you choose to widen the sixth. Trust your ear, or that of the editor. In general, the flatting of the lower voice works better in modes that sound like modern minor, things like Phrygian and Dorian. Anything that carries something sounding like modern major nearly always works better with the sharpened upper note. There are often, as in this case, two solutions to musica ficta problems. And in fact, we know that performers in the Renaissance themselves sometimes disagree about how a piece should have been fictized. So if it's confusing to us, we can be a little comforted by the fact that sometimes they weren't sure either. There's a sort of amusing story from around 1500 that describes a near fist fight between two singers in the papal choir caused by two singers arguing over which ficta should be used. You can make the most of important ficta decisions by applying these few rules. To review, number 1, avoid melodic tritones. 2, avoid harmonic tritones. And 3, approach two-voice cadences by widening the sixth, which resolves to the octave, or narrowing the third, which resolves to the unison. I've decided, just for time's sake and simplicity, not to discuss one other instance of ficta which happens relatively frequently. The rule that's known for the doggerel Latin rhyme, which is taught to help young musicians learn this rule. Una nota super la, semper est canendum fa. I suppose this sort of simple rhyming tune is a little bit like, here in the United States at least, we try to teach young musicians sometimes that the notes that fall on the lines of the treble clef staff, E, G, B, D, and F, can be remembered by every good boy does fine or every good boy deserves fudge. So the 16th century version of that, I think, is una nota super la, semper est canendum fa. I'll leave the specifics of that rule for those of you who want to explore it more on your own. There are lots of places you can read about that. Or if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to send you some notes on that. But as I said, I think we've covered enough ground for one 1-hour lecture, and we'll go on now again to hear some music rather than talking, because music is why we're all here. So we'll listen now to the Kyrie from the Josquin Mass, sung by a wonderful group of musicians who sang together in the vocal ensemble Fuma Sacra, in a recording that we made about 20 years ago. In addition to being spectacular singers, these are many of my very closest friends, and I hope you hear the closeness, the human closeness that is part of this group in the musical closeness with which they sing. I certainly think I do. So here is the Kyrie from the Josquin Missa de Beata Vergine. I do love that Josquin Mass. The last thing we'll talk about today isn't really a performance practice, but a pocket of repertoire with a particular point of view. I should probably stop and give a footnote just that we barely will scratch the surface of Renaissance performance practice and Renaissance repertoire today. You can spend a lifetime exploring this repertoire and still barely scratch the surface. We've mostly looked at sacred music up till now, but there was, of course, a thriving market for secular music in addition. And the most important Italian secular genre, the madrigal, was the genre that served as the laboratory for the experiments that moved us from the musical world of the Renaissance to that of the Baroque. When we look to madrigals, or to sacred music from the later 16th century after the madrigal craze was well underway and influencing sacred music at the end of the Renaissance, we're primarily tracing the way that composers explored the idea of word painting. Although other kinds of music express text in general ways, sad texts have generally inspired sad music, we're talking about a different level of relationship between word and music when we get to the madrigal. This becomes extreme by the end of the genre with bold contributions by composers such as Monteverdi and Gesualdo. But even in the earliest madrigals, like the one we'll look at, we see the interest in word painting beginning to flourish. And it is this interest in the specific text painting of the word, the way in which musical symbolism aligns almost point by point with textual symbolism, is the thing that takes us into the Baroque, and in some ways makes this music feel more and more modern. That this becomes an approach that we'll see in Schubert and Wolf and Stravinsky and Benjamin Britten. But in fact, it was in some ways invented by the madrigalists that we'll be looking at now. Jacques Arcadelt was, like most of the great composers working in Italy in the first half of the 16th century, foreign born, specifically coming from what is now northern France or Belgium. These composers were so dominant and so numerous in northern Italian courts that they had their own name, Oltramontani, or those from over the mountains, meaning the Alps. Later musicologists at the beginning and middle of the 20th century would talk about the Franco-Flemish school or the Netherlandish school to apply to these composers who were born and trained in the Low Countries of Flanders, Belgium, Netherlands, or northern France. And Arcadelt, like many of them, were a group of composers that invented the madrigal, interestingly enough, in a language that wasn't their own native vernacular language. They took texts in the vernacular, meaning Italian, and as they set them, experimented with how they could make the words come to life. They and their successors did this primarily by using dissonance to paint words like dolor, which means sorrow, or oime. And in fact, for instance, by the time we get to Monteverdi, he's criticized in some pamphlets for being capricious and breaking all the musical rules. But fascinatingly, the pamphlet criticizing Monteverdi leaves out all text. And the response, written by Monteverdi's brother, says, well, of course you don't understand why he writes a dissonance in this place unexpectedly and unpreparedly. It's not following the rules of music, it's following the rules of rhetoric. It's following the rules of poetry. It's saying that if we want to sing the word pain, we should somehow feel something that equates to that pain. In addition to dissonance, these composers also used other disruptive musical techniques, like abrupt changes in texture. It is interesting that the madrigal is largely a genre obsessed with differentiation and contrast, whereas, for instance, the beautiful sacred music we were listening to of Byrd and Josquin tends to be more about finding a homogeneous, unified whole. But variety, shock, and difference becomes more and more the watchword of the madrigalists. We don't have time to fully explore this genre, but it's a rich one that is full of known and unknown masterpieces. We'll finish our time together by taking a brief look at a very early madrigal, Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno by Arcadelt, one of the first generation of the great madrigals. You'll be able to find a score for this in the links that have been provided for you. Like most madrigal texts, its greatest virtue is its use of contrast or paradox. In this case, the song of the swan is contrasted with the song of the poet. According to long-standing legend, the swan, the most beautiful of all birds, sings only once. I think this is probably grows out of the fact that swans don't sing songs like nightingales or swallows or other birds, but they look so beautiful that we as musicians wish they would sing something as beautiful as their physical representation. So the legend grew up that the swan sings only once, and when it sings, it is the most beautiful song in the world, and this is the song they sing immediately before they die. This is why in English, and also in other languages like German and French, we have the term swan song. And swan song in English means a final declaration, usually one of overwhelming beauty. So again, sort of an example of that is that Schubert died in the middle of writing a set of songs, and his publisher titled the group of songs Schwanengesang, or Swan Song, because he was suggesting that Schubert had left his most beautiful music for his last utterance. The beautiful song of the swan emerges filled with sorrow at its own impending death. So one of the contrasts is that the swan song is incredibly beautiful, even though the swan wishes he didn't have to sing it. There's a larger contrast, though, and that's that the contrast of the swans, the song of the swan, is juxtaposed with the song of the poet, who dies metaphorically rather than actually. As in many madrigals and other Renaissance writings, death can be seen as a euphemism for sexual climax. So the song of the poet, or the lover, is not beautiful, but he experiences, as he makes less beautiful sounds, a beautiful emotion and a beautiful sense of connection to his beloved. And unlike the swan, who never wants to die again and doesn't even want to die the first time, the poet/beloved wishes to die over and over 1,000 times a day. As we've said, Arkadelt's setting is a very early madrigal. Later composers would have made the contrast even more dramatic and more disruptive. But we can see the roots of the Baroque even in this simple early work, especially in its text painting. And I would suggest that one of the most important things, it's not exactly performance practice, but one of the most important approaches and mindsets for understanding how to perform these madrigals convincingly and emotionally, authentically for both your choirs and your audiences, is to emphasize this sense of contrast. That we do know, for instance, in the late madrigals, we have fascinating descriptions of the singers adding extemporaneous hand gestures as if they were acting them out, as if they were music theater singers more than classical singers. And so when we have strong contrasts in these madrigals, my suggestion is we find ways to complement these contrasts with other performance choices. So for instance, the madrigal begins depicting the swan. You'll notice there is no bass voice, and the top voice mostly sings a single note as a long pedal. The effect of this is to depict the swan floating on top of the water. It doesn't have the gravity that would drag it down of the bass voice, and the way that the top voice floats above motion underneath mimics the image of the feet of the swan paddling away while the serene body floats atop. At the entrance of the bass, the text changes and we are introduced to the speaker. And so, and we are also taught that the speaker is weeping, piangendo. So the swan is described as dolce and bianco, white and serene, but the singer is described, the beloved is described as weeping. So here's an example of one place I think that you can make interesting choices as a performer. That we want the sound of the opening few bars to be about purity and serenity and otherworldly beauty. But when the bass enters, we want the sound to be human and dark and deep and full of sadness and emotion. The way we speak the words, the piangendo, especially the G sound, is full of possibilities for making that word really ring. The way that the texture changes when the bass enters. In most other Renaissance music, if there's a texture with 3 parts and the bass enters, we might want to hide the fact that the texture has changed, because Josquin's attitude is often to try to make all 4 voices sound like one homogeneous whole. But in this piece, clearly the entrance of the bass is meant to trigger in the hearer an awareness of something different, of something human and tortured. Soon after, there's the text strano e diversa sorte, which means strange and diverse fates. In almost every other section of the madrigal, the voices move in homophony, where all 4 voices declaim the text together. But at this part of the poem, the bass voice detaches from the upper voices, echoing the way that the bass voice entered later in the very first phrase, and again showing how the fate of the swan is different from and strangely diverting from the fate of the human being. This madrigal, typical of early madrigals but very unlike the later examples of this genre, has very little dissonance. If you look through, you'll be hard-pressed to find any harmony that is not a simple triad. In fact, I've done that, and there's only one place in the entire piece that has a dissonance that is a seventh chord. Everything else is a simple triad. It's interesting, the dissonance of the chord is used on the word gioia, or joy, in tutta gioia, all joy. And this dissonance creates, I think, a shiver of delight that runs up and down the spine of the poet and the performer and the listener as he experiences the joy of connection with his beloved. So again, when you get to the word gioia, I would suggest you think about ways that you can, as a performer, heighten the experience of this word for your audience. For me, I would have the altos do a bit of a crescendo from the note before gioia to the D of gioia, which is in dissonance against the bass E, so that we hear a little of increased intensity and the sense of tension and release, which gives us the sense of joy and the shiver of delight of gioia. The final section of Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno is the most famous and perhaps the most forward-looking. It breaks into imitative polyphony. Rather than all the voices speaking the same words at the same time, they echo the words back and forth. We know that Arkadelt was an accomplished master of the imitative style because he used this very frequently in his sacred music. But here, in this madrigal, he has avoided polyphony until the very ending of the piece. He has saved the me-too-ness of imitative polyphony for the poet's final statement. The final line says that he would like to die 1,000,000 times a day, over and over. This imitative gesture is repeated by every voice part, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. This paints simply, but so effectively, the desire to repeat over and over again the act of love which has created this sense of joy within the poet. And so now we'll listen to a performance of Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno, and I hope you have enjoyed hearing all three of these pieces we've looked at, the Josquin, I guess four, the Palestrina, the Josquin, the Bird, and the Arkadelt. They're all exquisite pieces, and as I said, they just scratch the surface of the extraordinary riches that there are in 15th and 16th century polyphony. So I hope that some of the things we've said today will help demystify the performance of it, and that you'll feel emboldened to, with your choirs, explore this incredibly rich, incredibly humanly interesting and evocative time and style of music. So after Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno, I bid you adieu, and I hope that you've had a wonderful time. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. Bye-bye.